What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so continuing on with Green Lantern's secret origin, again, this is why I say that Geoff Johns' run, a lot of the stories that he tells are really self-contained. Secret Origin was designed to be this updated retelling of the early days of Hal Jordan as he became the Green Lantern, while he was the Green Lantern, so on and so forth. It's really just kind of this rehashing of things. So that's why I say this is so cool, is because if we take Secret Origin and we basically kick off Geoff Johns' Green Lantern run with Secret Origin, then we create this totally self-contained, cohesive continuity that doesn't require us to really know anything before Geoff Johns started. That's one of the reasons why it's so cool. There's a few things we need to know here and there, but of course, the second video really picks up with Hector Hammond. Now again, Hector Hammond, the way that he's introduced here is starkly different from, the way that we saw him before. Prior to this, Hector Hammond was still, a bad guy, but the way that he gained his powers was different. The same process was a meteor, but the way it was, or I guess the way he came across it was different. It was like in the woods or something along those lines. What this does is make it a little more cohesive, make a little more sense, in the sense that because of the fact that Hector Hammond is basically a private consultant for Ferris Aircraft, for Ferris Air. When Ferris gets a hold of the ship, or at least when the U.S. Air Force gets a hold of the ship that Avengers had crash landed in, Hector Hammond is one of the guys who's investigating it. Now, what Geoff Johns gives us is basically the groundwork for what Hector Hammond will become, which is to say, in this instance, Hector Hammond is very abrasive. He really sees things as his way or the highway. But what we also find out is that he is not viewed by anybody in a good way. And what I mean here is that where people, with the people that he's working with are talking about how the engine core, is kind of kept closed, it's difficult to access, they don't really know what's inside of it, they shouldn't just crack it open. Hector Hammond just busts the thing wide open, and when he does, he's exposed to the meteor energy source, and he's basically endowed with telepathy and telekinesis. It modifies the structure of his brain that gives him new powers. The problem is that it's not necessarily something he can control initially. Instead, what ends up happening is, just like anybody in comic books who develops telepathy, he begins just, unintentionally reading the mind of those around him. And what he learns is that everybody hates him. People consider him weird. They consider him strange. They consider him somebody who's just socially awkward, doesn't have any social skills. They just look at him as just an odd fellow. Now, this is interesting because what Geoff Johns does is he says, look, Hector Hammond could have gone two ways. I mean, this fraction of a second was a crossroads. He could have taken their words to heart and, become something better than what he was, or he could have just stayed on the path that he was on. Now, in truth, with the path that he was on, his powers were of such a level that he easily could have just dealt with all these guys, and that's what he does. He lashes out and he kills them all, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, opinions are useless to a dead man, and so because of this, Hector Hammond effectively falls down the path of being a bad guy. He falls down the path of being a villain. But what's going to be interesting about this is that instead of just, his powers running amok, he's going to harness them pretty fast, and Geoff Johns is going to say, hey, look, this is why Hector Hammond is going to be a bad guy from this point going forward. Now, of course, from here, we pick up with the return of Hal Jordan. That's one of the cool things here, is Geoff Johns kind of plays it fast and loose with regards to Hal Jordan returning to Earth, but he does it in a way that makes sense. What Hal Jordan basically says is that once he was finished with his boot camp training, the Ring said, you will be alerted of any extraterrestrial threats in your sector. Now you're going back home, and the Ring just teleports him back to Earth. Now, of course, he comes across Tom, the mechanic at Ferris Air. Of course, Tom, prior to Geoff Johns' Green Lantern, we knew that Tom was kind of like this really close friend of Hal Jordan, and was one who was basically kind of going through this whole, the last will and testament of Hal Jordan. We talked about in our video about Kyle Rayner becoming God. But what we also find out is that where Arden Air Force, or Arden Air, was this place basically where, former pilots, existing pilots, were helping to test aircraft. With Ferris Air moving in with the intention of buying Arden Air, all the pilots have quit. Now, this is not because of the fact that it's just viewed as a hostile takeover. It's not because of loyalty to Arden Air. It's because of the stigma that follows Ferris Air. And this tells us how deep the death of Hal Jordan's father goes, that it doesn't just impact him. The pilots everywhere look at Ferris Air and say, that guy took shortcuts. Carl Ferris took shortcuts. And when he did, it resulted in the death of an Air Force pilot. Nobody wants to fly a death trap. And that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that the Ferris Air will show up and say, hey guys, here's an aircraft that the Air Force wants to test. Here's another aircraft the Air Force wants to test. And they have, they're afraid they'll have no idea if the time they go up in the air to test that whatever that aircraft happens to be, if that will be their last time. Nobody wants to go the way of Hal Jordan's father. So because of this, Carol Ferris really kind of has to look around and realize that because of the things that her father did, that she's basically running a failing business, that nobody wants to come in and, as great as it is with her being, a test flight company, of what use space is her company if no one's willing to test, aircraft for her company. And so with the arrival of Hal Jordan, this is kind of cool because this is kind of, I love the way that Geoff Johns does is it's one of these things where like opposites attract. And again, they have a history, a history only insofar as like Hal Jordan knew her when she was a kid. But I like the whole idea of like opposites attracting. And this is that Hal Jordan walks in and he basically says, yeah, like, when Carol's like, hey, are you here to quit too? He's like, yep, like put my name on the list of resignations. And they start arguing and bickering with one another. But then this is really when Hal Jordan starts to let it out and says, look, the reason why everybody's leaving is because they don't trust you. They don't trust the name of your family. Your dad took shortcuts. They're afraid you're going to take shortcuts and you're going to get somebody killed. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that because of the actions of Hal Jordan, remember, he had basically punched out his superior officer, General Stone. He had basically been booted out from the Air Force. His desire to fly lasted only so long as someone who was basically a friend of the family would kind of sneak him under the radar, give him a helping hand here and there. What Carol Ferris is offering is the ability to get him back into the air, to officially reinstate him as somebody who can legally fly aircraft. Now, Hal Jordan's initial response is one of anger, one of outrage, because he doesn't want to be part of Ferris Air, but at the same time, it's an allure that he can't avoid. And that's what's so cool about Hal Jordan. That's one of the things that I love about his character so much, is because Hal Jordan has a power ring, right? I mean, all he has to do is slap on his Green Lantern ring, say the words, charge his ring, and fly. That's all he has. I mean, he could just fly. But for him, it's about jets, because jets have danger. A jet could fail. Somebody could crash into him. A bird could hit him at the wrong angle. A meteor could come crashing into the Earth that's not big enough to destroy a planet, but certainly big enough to take out a jet. There's any number of things that could happen that could put his life in danger. It's the thrill of flying a jet. Not only that, a jet's been his entire life. It's been everything that he's known. And so because of that, flying with his own ring is not the same as flying a jet. And in the end, flying a jet is something that he can't leave behind anymore. And so he basically ends up allying himself with Carol Ferris. Now, at this point, we switch back over to Atrocitus. So this is why I say Geoff Johns did so much world building in the Secret Origin. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to basically kind of jump back and do the Secret Origin first. This is when we start to get really into the idea of the prophecy of the Blackest Night. Prior to this point, it was just, well, Abin Sur was told by Atrocitus of the prophecy of the Blackest Night. We have no idea what that means. Of course, we know now that the prophecy of Blackest Night means that there will be basically a rise of different Lantern Corps. All those Lantern Corps will go to war with one another. They will all be destroyed. There will be no more light, and it'll simply just be the Blackest Night. That's basically kind of, what it means more or less. But what we end up finding out here is that, remember, with Atrocitus being a survivor of the Manhunters wiping out Sector 666 and being one of the remaining, 5 inversions or whatever it is, because of that, Atrocitus, basically consumes the heart of men. He basically eats people, but he throws their blood onto a skull of sorts. And what he basically ends up getting is this word called William Hand. Of course, the man that we know will eventually become Black Hand, become basically a representative of Necron, the entity of the Black Lantern Corps. So again, this is really just kind of Geoff Johns throwing in, peppering in these little tidbits, these little things here and there that give us an idea of how dangerous things can be. Now, of course, with Hal Jordan flying for Ferris Air, once he's actually in the air, once he's taken off as a pilot, for him, all's right with the world. The problem is that this sentiment of all being right with the world comes to an end quick, fast, and in a hurry. And the reason why is because Sinestro shows up in his path. And Sinestro's response is, what are you doing? Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, Rob Core will be, man, I'm going to be honest with you guys now. I love Sinestro. He is amazing. I love Sinestro as a bad guy. Like, even when he was just a Green Lantern, he's just a jerk. But it is hilarious the way he conducts himself. Now, at this point in his path of being a Green Lantern, Sinestro is order in the extreme. I mean, he's regimented, he's structured. We can tell that by his hair and by how well manicured his mustache is. He is a man of order, but he also resents everything that Hal Jordan stands against. And that's why the two bumped heads almost immediately. When Sinestro shows up, Hal Jordan begins, asking all these questions. Well, who are you? Why are you here? Why did you basically destroy a $20 million jet? Sinestro's response is, do not question a superior officer. Do not question someone who's more powerful than you. Well, Hal Jordan immediately is like, well, nope, now I know you're not going to be a friend of mine because I challenge superior, I challenge authority all the time. That's exactly what I do. And of course, the two of them kind of butt heads a little bit, but what this is Geoff Johns showing up and pointing out all the flaws of Hal Jordan. And that's why I love Sinestro, because with Sinestro being here is one of these things where Sinestro's really good at what he does, and he'll make Hal Jordan even better. The problem is Sinestro is a jerk about the way that he does it, but it's one of these cool things. To kind of sidetrack for a second, I know it doesn't really make any sense here, but bear with me for a second. For years and years and years, I used to play Call of Duty all the time, and I got on YouTube and I watched different YouTubers. There were people out there like the Mark of J. Like, if you pay attention to what he says, he'll make you better as a player. That's basically kind of what's happening here with regards to to Sinestro. That was the best example I could think of. It kind of comes out of nowhere, but that's the best example I could think of. Sinestro is he's just a jerk for all intents and purposes. But if you listen to what he says, he will make Hal Jordan a better person. He'll make him a better Green Lantern. And that's exactly what ends up happening. More ironically than that, Hal Jordan is getting a lesson here from Sinestro that most Green Lanterns could only ever dream of having. Like, Sinestro would never come down and train new Green Lanterns. He would never play the role of Kilowog. But to get a one-on-one lesson with Sinestro, the greatest Green Lantern in existence, Hal Jordan is getting something that almost nobody ever gets. And this is what he tells me. He says, look, man, your constructs are a reflection of your willpower. Your willpower has to be focused. Your willpower has to be trained. Fear will crack your willpower. Anger will crack your willpower. Your willpower has to be pure. When you achieve that goal, when you make your willpower as pure as it needs to be, nothing is beyond your ability to perform. And this is what he does. He basically recreates, he brings the plane back together of Hal Jordan. And that's what's so cool, is because what Sinestro says is, you need more training. I'm here because a friend of mine was killed, because, Avengers was killed, because he's being chased by Atrocitus, or at least it's believed to be that case. If you're the Green Lantern of this sector, you need more training. You need to be taught how to be an effective Green Lantern. And so what ends up happening is, of course, the two of them kind of part ways. They kind of end up, splitting off. But what ends up also happening here is, of course, when Hal Jordan gets back to Ferris Air, they're immediately set upon by Hector Hammond. Now, of course, again, this is why I say Hector Hammond is kind of elevated here. His telepathy, his telekinesis, but it's kind of removed his humanity. But the cool thing about this is that when it comes to Hal Jordan, when it comes to really anybody in particular, physical punches, physical assaults are nothing in comparison to somebody who would be able to assault them mentally. And the reason why is because our thoughts are the one place that we could go where we can be private. We can be alone. Nobody can know what we're thinking. They can speculate, they can guess and be right, but they'll never know with any absolute certainty. It's our one safe haven. It's the last fig leaf. And because of this, it is basically Hal Jordan and Carol Ferris being violated in the most extreme way, because their inner thoughts, their inner desires, their lusts, their fears, the things that they hate the most, the regrets they have, all of those are just items. They're baubles in the hand of Hector Hammond, just scrolling through them, just perusing through them, and they've never felt a sense of helplessness quite like this. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that Hector Hammond is very much infatuated, very much lustful after Carol Ferris. I wouldn't call it love. Love is something organic. Love is something true. It takes time to develop. Hector Hammond is just lustful. He just wants to get Carol Ferris between the sheets. That's really all he wants to do here. But Hal Jordan, of course, donning his ring, this is when he begins to learn that his willpower just doesn't seem to be there, that his willpower just doesn't seem to be capable, that for whatever reason, he's not able to tap into it the way that he needs to. Now, of course, we'll learn that this is a reflection of Hal Jordan's own self-doubt. This is a reflection of Hal Jordan's own lack of belief in himself. He doesn't feel like his willpower is there because it isn't there, because it's just not where it needs to be. Now, of course, Sinestro jumps in and basically saves Hal Jordan by way of just, more or less shutting off the air supply of Hector Hammond. But again, this is Sinestro saying, you need more training. You need to be taught better. And that's what he does. Sinestro basically takes Hal Jordan under his ring as they go through all these different investigations. They go through this huge journey to try to find out what happened to Abensur, what it is that happened with Atrocitus and so on and so forth. Now, the funny thing about this too is that Hal Jordan directly asked Sinestro about why it is that Green Lanterns are weak to the color yellow, because keep in mind, this is before anybody knew that the parallax entity was confined inside the central battery. And so for all they knew, it was just a weakness to the color yellow. It was just the yellow impurity. They didn't know that parallax inside of the central battery was basically seeding weakness into the Green Lanterns themselves. Now, of course, Sinestro says, we don't know, and that's not for you to ask. It's not your job to ask the question of why it is that the yellow impurity is there. But even he goes as far as to say, I've been attempting to seek out the truth for why that's the case. I've been attempting to try to find out why it is that there's a yellow impurity. Now, we know this is basically Jeff Johns kind of saying this is how it is that Sinestro eventually becomes the harbinger, the face of Parallax, becomes the head of the Sinestro Corps. This is Jeff Johns saying this is how these things begin to sort of grow and evolve and so on. But what ends up happening is Hal Jordan takes Sinestro to where it is that Abensur was buried. And this is when Hal Jordan begins to learn of the relationship between Sinestro and Abensur, in the sense that Abensur was Sinestro's mentor. They were extremely close friends. I would go as far as to say that Abensur is probably the one person that Sinestro actually trusted. But of course, with Sinestro being in such close proximity to Hal Jordan, what it does is it triggers the message confined inside the ring of Abensur. And what ends up happening is Abensur basically begins to go through and tells Sinestro everything he knows. The prophecy of the Black Blackest Night, the 5 inversions, everything that's been going on, the idea that there will be a multitude, there'll be like 5 other lantern corps that will crop up. These other lantern corps will basically all go to war against one another, the red, the blue, the indigo, so on and so forth. They'll all go to war against one another, and it'll lead to the end of all emotion, and everything will come crashing down. He spills out the beans on Atrocitus. The 5 inversions, these are people that basically came out of the massacre of Sector 666. The Manhunters, the predecessors to the Green Lanterns, basically had a flaw in their programming. We'll find out what that flaw is and what happened that set them on that path, but there'll be a flaw in the Manhunters program. They'll lay waste to Sector 666. The survivors will come together with an empire of tears, and they will eventually form themselves into an enemy of the Green Lantern Corps. This is constantly what's happening here. Now, at this point, we switch back over to William Hand with regards to his whole family. Now, the reason why I kind of held off on this William Hand thing for a second is because I wanted to actually wait until we got into the section of the story that delved into William Hand. But essentially, William Hand is a member of a family that deals with funerals. His life is surrounded by death. But something else that I hope you also notice here is that the Black Lantern symbol is William Hand's family crest. It's their family symbol. And that's cool because what this means is that it's not as though these symbols are kind of, preordained. Those symbols are just created. They're a reflection of the different corps themselves. Black Hand is a man unto himself. He can resurrect, we'll see the whole resurrection, with regards to Blackest Night. But in terms of Black Hand, he's basically a lantern corps unto himself. That's kind of how it initially starts out. His obsession with death initially leads him to encountering Atrocitus. And Atrocitus begins to talk about, you're a doorway into the darkness. You're a person that's going to bring about the Blackest Night. Now, of course, we'll find out really how this Blackest Night prophecy stands once we get to Sinestro Corps War. But this is still pretty cool because what this basically says is that it's not enough that there are going to be lanterns that are basically going to wage war against one another and they're all going to die. There's a next step after this. There's the rise of the Black Lanterns, the rise of death, of destruction, of darkness, of eternal death, to the universe itself. It's this really foreboding scenario. But of course, with the arrival of Sinestro and the arrival of Hal Jordan, the cool thing is that Hal Jordan basically gets a crash course in how to use his ring. With regards to the fight against Atrocitus, this is not some training scenario. And that's what Sinestro says. You're not in training, my friend. You're not in boot camp. You're in the real world. Either you can harness your willpower and you can succeed, or you will fail. But we also get these crash course lessons that Hal Jordan gets in terms of like pocket dimensions, storing his power battery in some location that will basically keep it safe, keep it from being destroyed. Again, it's all these little small tidbits that go towards Hal Jordan becoming a better Green Lantern. Now, facing off against Atrocitus, because of the fact that Hal Jordan is so new, in his mind, he can create constructs to a degree, but they're still not fleshed out. They're still not really where they need to be. They're still not really that capable. Atrocitus can still punch through them. But all this begins to change when Atrocitus says, I know your rage. I know your anger. I know that you are weak. I know that you do not have the ability to be somebody of any real measure. Now, of course, he's saying all this to Sinestro in the process of getting ready to kill Sinestro. Hal Jordan comes to his aid. And when he does that, he forces a construct to take out a tractor. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be entirely irrelevant, but the tractor is yellow. The construct should have had no impact on the tractor. The construct should have broken apart on the tractor. The construct should have fallen apart before it reached the tractor because of the yellow impurity. Now, the reason why this matters is because this is where Sinestro really begins to learn what's going on. This is where Hal Jordan himself begins to realize what's going on with the yellow impurity. The yellow impurity is not an intrinsic thing. The yellow impurity is not something that's just inherent to Green Lanterns. It's not just a natural part of the Green Lantern power. The yellow impurity is artificial. It's an external factor. It's an external source. If it can be overcome, that means that it's not part of the Green Lantern landscape. Someone put it there. And so what this does is this really kind of bolsters the curiosity of Sinestro anymore. Now, he doesn't really say anything to Hal Jordan. Hal Jordan kind of makes a comment about, hey, did you see that? I use the ring against yellow. Sinestro kind of takes this away. The way that Jeff Johns gives it to us, it's almost like Sinestro takes this as an affront in the sense that Hal Jordan was able to do something that Sinestro was never able to do. And so it kind of comes across as this situation like, Sinestro feels like he feels challenged by Hal Jordan. He feels like Hal Jordan has the potential to become better than he is. And that's true in a lot of ways. But more so than that, this is Sinestro learning that the yellow impurity is artificial. There's something in the central power battery that makes Green Lanterns weak to the color yellow. Hal Jordan was able to temporarily overcome it. And so again, this really kind of bolsters the curiosity of Sinestro with regards to everything else that's going on. But again, Sinestro saying your ring, your willpower serves serves the purpose of forcing you to face your fears. If you cannot face your fears, you will never be an adequate Green Lantern. And so, because of this, we basically have kind of, Hal Jordan flying off on his own, Hal Jordan, trying to avoid Sinestro, but in his anger and in his wrath, he races off to Carol Ferris. He races off to her family home, confronts her and says, I want to speak to your father. I want to speak to Carl Ferris. Breaks into Carl Ferris's room only to find that Carl Ferris is bedridden, that he's sick. He's in no condition to run the company. And this is when we learn the truth of what was going on. The death of Hal Jordan's father was not done by a man who was just trying to cut corners for the purpose of saving a buck. Carl Ferris was trying to keep his business afloat, but the death of Hal Jordan's father crushed Carl Ferris. It ate him alive, and it ate him to the point where he basically just kind of began to lose the will to live. And so Carol Ferris has basically been making up a series of excuses. Well, my father's out playing golf. My father's doing this. He's doing that. He'd love to be here, And while she put off the air of the fact that her father basically was too good to be there with the rest of the grunts, so to speak, what ends up happening here is Hal Jordan learns the truth, that Carol sees herself as a spoiled little girl. She always saw herself as a spoiled little girl. But when the time came for her to step up and to run the family business, she was able to do that. And this is when Hal Jordan's loyalties began to shift. In truth, Hal Jordan was flying for Ferris Air because he wanted to just be able to fly again. But Hal Jordan also now feels a kinship to Carol Ferris. And the reason why is because he basically comes to the realization that she's alone. It's just her. There's no one else. It's just Carol Ferris. Much like Hal Jordan, he's got nobody else. His brother Jim is, somewhat a part of his life to a degree. His brother Jack hates him. His father's dead. His mother's dead. Hal Jordan feels very isolated, very alone in the world. And in this kind of a situation, what it does is it allows two people to find solace in one another. It allows Carol Ferris and Hal Jordan to come together in a relationship. Now, what this also does is it forces Hal Jordan to reconcile. It forces him to look into himself and to basically let the memory of his father go. And that's what's so beautiful about this, is because this whole story is simply just Hal Jordan not being able to come to grips with the fact that everyone passes, that everyone dies. Sometimes we die in honorable ways. Sometimes there's no honor to it, but everybody passes. The struggle of Hal Jordan's life, the failures that he'd experienced, his recklessness, his inability to tap into the full might of his willpower, all of that extended from the fact that he could not let his father go. But he finally does. He finally comes to grips with it. He finally comes to terms with it. And this is the real lesson of Sinestro. And this is the moment. This is the moment in this story where I was like, this is when I now begin to love Sinestro. This is why Sinestro is now my favorite villain. There's this great exchange between the two of them. It's one of the coolest exchanges ever. There's a great exchange. What Sinestro says is, you have now learned the power of the Green Lantern ring. The Green Lantern ring it gives you the will to do the things that you need to do, whatever those things may be. The Green Lantern ring will give you the willpower to let your father go. The Green Lantern ring will give you the willpower to live, and this is when Hal Jordan says, look, I understand, you're right. And Sinestro's response is, I know. I know. I know I was right. And that's why I love that. He doesn't do it like a reasonable human being. He was like, well, I'm glad you're beginning to understand the lessons of a Green Lantern. He's just like, yeah, I know I was right. Like, what a dick. That's why I love him so much. He's my favorite guy. But nonetheless, it's cool. This is also Sinestro kind of teaching, Hal Jordan about, the dangers of anger and so on and so forth. But again, it's creating a measure of respect between the two. It's Sinestro basically saying that when it comes to things like regret, when it comes to things like loss, things like guilt, Green Lanterns always struggle with that. And the reason why is because Green Lanterns are always the first ones into the conflict. Green Lanterns end up losing friends. Green Lanterns end up sometimes wishing they'd never made friends in the first place because they end up losing them in battle. But this is what Sinestro says. It's always, that's the eternal struggle. That's the eternal conflict that you go against, is the idea that you're constantly facing off against, forces that would seek to strip you of your power. Fear, anger, regret, remorse. Those are things that will constantly seek to strip you of your abilities, of your willpower. You have to remain ever vigilant. You can't give up who you are, but you constantly have to stay on the defensive to make sure that your connection with willpower never goes away. Now, of course, at the tail end of this discussion, they're really just kind of like whisked away to they're really kind of whisked away to the Guardians of the Universe. And this is really the first time that Hal Jordan is actually meeting them. And the funny thing about this is that Hal Jordan begins to show the Guardians what he is about, is the best way that I can explain it. The funny thing is the Guardians, talk about the new Green Lantern of Sector, 2814. Hal Jordan's like, well, he's like, my name's Hal Jordan. And the Sinestro's response is, they know that. They know who you are, Hal Jordan. They're well aware of who you are. Now, at this point, this is when Sinestro basically says, hey, look, there was a lot going on. Avengers had basically died there, so on and so forth. The prophecy of the Blackest Night and, all that kind of good stuff. But again, what ends up happening is the Guardians basically set down the rules, or at least they explain the rules to Hal Jordan, that no Green Lanterns are allowed to team up with one another. They have to patrol their own sector. There are no Green Lanterns that team up. Hal Jordan has his sector, 2814. Sinestro has his sector, 1417. They're not allowed to cross over into each other's sectors. The only time that is permitted is when the Guardians say it's permitted, but they can't go off and do it on their own. Now, of course, Hal Jordan asks the question, why? And because, well, the Guardians say, well, because working independently makes you stronger, and then his question is, why? And then the Guardians are like, well, we've just lived for 1 billion years. Don't question us. We know what we're talking about. And that's what's kind of interesting here is because, Geoff Johns is setting the seeds of saying that the Guardians will not give the Green Lanterns all the answers they want. Some of this is because of the fact that the Guardians themselves just want to maintain information to themselves. Sometimes it's because of the fact that the Guardians just do not want to see the truth of the situation. We'll find that out once we get to the Sinestro Corps War, and you have Ganthet and you have Sade, who are like the two holdouts saying, this is going to happen. The prophecy of the Blackest Night is going to happen, but none of the other Guardians want to listen. So again, it's really kind of cool because despite their vaunted, lack of emotions, despite their wisdom and how long they've been around, the Guardians are very, very much human in terms of how they conduct themselves. Their mysticism, their cloak and dagger attitude, everything's very black and white, so on and so forth. But at this point, because of the fact that Hal Jordan's basically just been popping off at the mouth, the Guardians of the Universe are like, you're facing expulsion, dude. Like, we're going to kick you out if you keep running, if you keep, talking about who you is. Well, then at that point, Sinestro kind of chimes in and says, look, if you kick out Hal Jordan, you kick out me. Now, this is not really Sinestro putting his faith in Hal Jordan. It is to a degree, but it's really more of Sinestro looking at the legacy of Abensur. Abensur personally said, look, Hal Jordan, met Hal Jordan and said, you are my replacement now. It's really just kind of carrying on what it is that Abensur had going, in terms of passing his legacy on. But I think there is also still, some measure of trust here between Sinestro and Hal Jordan. At the very least, Sinestro probably respects Hal Jordan more so than he respects anybody else, or at least as close as Sinestro can get to respecting a person. But, at this point, because of the fact that the Guardians are not going to give up their greatest Green Lantern, instead, they kind of offer a compromise. What they say is, Hal Jordan will be your direct pupil. He will learn directly from you. He will be your responsibility. If he fails, then that's your failure. And again, of course, Sinestro ends up kind of taking this on, but this is the road that Hal Jordan follows to making him such a great Green Lantern. But again, this really all kind of begins to sort of wind down, begins to come to an end with regards to, Sinestro taking the body of Atrocitus, or at least, intending to taking him back to Ismail, to his own home, and keep him prisoner there, which we'll find out, as part of the whole Sinestro Corps War, exactly what it was that happened in this scenario. But with Hal Jordan returning back home and, him being with Carol Ferris, the two of them are close, but as far as she says, look, it's Miss Ferris, it's not Carol. It's maintaining this propriety between the two of them. So while they're not necessarily romantic in the traditional sense, there is always going to be this sort of give and take. There's going to be this tug back and forth between the two of them, always looking at the idea that they're basically going to, possibly get together at some point along the line. But again, the road is constantly being set. The road is constantly being paved. For example, with Sinestro, setting Atrocitus back to Ismail, back to his home planet, what Atrocitus says is, we've seen the future. We know what fate awaits you. We know that Karuger will descend into absolute civil unrest and riots. We know that it will descend into absolute madness, and you will do the only thing you know how to do. You will force order onto your home people. And when that happens, you are going to become effectively an evil Green Lantern. You're going to fall from the path of the Green Lantern, and you're going to become a bad guy, and the Guardians will turn against you. But again, it's just kind of this cool situation because ultimately the way the story kind of winds down, Hal Jordan, visits with his brother Jim, and Hal Jordan basically says, hey, look, it's time that I be honest with you. It's time that I be a good brother for you. It's time that I finally, trust you. I finally open up to you. And he basically says, I'm the Green Lantern. Of course, dons his ring, puts on his suit, or at least manifests his suit, and then gives to Jim the flight journal of Hal Jordan, the thing that contains everything, this entire origin story as it exists so far. But yeah, I really love this. I really love this. This origin story, I think, is a lot more complex than a lot of the stories that we're going to see with regards to what goes on in Geoff Johns' run of Green Lantern. The cool thing is we get these little tidbits here and there, Sins of the Star Sapphire, Mystery of the Star Sapphires, and the Sinestro Corps War Prelude, the Sinestro Corps War, and the one-shots. It's a lot more organized and a lot easier to digest than this origin story as we've gotten it so far. But if you guys are new here to Comments Explain, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.